Oh, good morning, everybody. Nice to see you again. I'm very pleased today to have Ashling Bourke with us from Dublin University, who is going to give the next presentation in this seminar. And I think maybe the best is that I let you present yourself, introduce yourself, so you can tell us everything we need to know about you for this seminar today. Thank you very much once again for being with us this morning.
That's no problem. Thanks for inviting me. So my name is Ashling Bourke. I'm a researcher and academic in a university in Dublin in Ireland. I'm a psychology, my psychology is my background. I lecture mainly to students who do multidisciplinary programs. So most of our students are human development students who study human development in terms of psychological, sociological, and philosophy lenses. So a lot of my work has kind of tended to take that more broadly multidisciplinary perspective. And I'm situated in an institute of education. So a lot of my work has kind of an education focus, given that where I work. And in the last few years, I've started to think about climate change and its impacts generally on people, but more specifically on children and adolescents. So today I'm going to present a couple of a couple of projects that we're working on in terms of how young people think about climate change and predominantly around emotions of climate change. And that's something that kind of transpired in our research when we're looking at how young people, and when I talk about adolescence, I'm talking about the wide range of adolescents. So from 10 to 24 type of age group. So thinking about young people and teenagers really. And one of the kind of striking piece, I suppose, in terms of the types of research that we're doing is when we're looking at how young people perceive climate change emotions, and the impact of climate change on young people's mental health is one of the key kind of findings that's emerging for us. I'm going to talk about a few different studies that we've done, but predominantly focusing on the impact of climate change in terms of mental health, climate change emotions, and climate change attitudes, which has that very clear kind of overlap with emotions. So I'm going to present a few slides and then we'll have maybe a discussion. I don't know, Pascal, if you want to moderate that, and then I'll talk about studies. And I'd really like to hear, so all the research that I'm going to present has been done in Ireland. So I'd really like to hear your perspectives in terms of how you think the findings might apply or might be different within your particular context in France.
Yeah, maybe I can just add a few words of context, because when we first talked, I also contacted you because you're working with young people as co-researchers. You have this approach, which I find very interesting. I find also very interesting that you consider as adolescents this wide age range. And so it means that some of you maybe are still adolescent, according to this perspective. Some of you may still be under 24 now. Yeah. So we have adolescents in this room, and so I think it would be really interesting to have this perspective, even if you're above 24 today, that we consider ourselves as co-researchers and not as passive listeners to a presentation. And I'm sure you have some experience as well, and I could share some experience of what I'm doing with the students as co-researchers as well. So.
Perfect. Yeah, that would be great. And I suppose, yeah, so one of the kind of key things in terms of our research methodologies is implementing Article 12 of the UNCRC, in that young people should be actively involved in any piece of research that we're doing. So in the studies that I present to you now, we have young people who are co-researchers. So we hire them for typically like 1 day, 2 days a week. They help us analyze our data. And then we have on the project that I present now an advisory board. So that will be made up of young people, and we will go to them going, how meaningful is this? Are these the right types of questions we should be asking? And then when we get the data, they help us then analyze it, because we don't want to be coming in with a very, I suppose, an academic lens, and also a very kind of, a lens that's centered on our own lived experience and what we expect to come from young people. We want it to be very much developed from the ground up. So that's the type of approach, but I can talk more about the methodology when I talk about the particular studies. So I should be sharing my screen now, is that?
Yeah,
we can great. See. Okay, great. So I'm going to predominantly talk to you about, so I use kind of interchange, like Pascal said, that the term young people and adolescents. So one of the studies that we've done was predominantly on young people 18 to 24, 25. And another one was on adolescents, which would be more at the 10 to 24 age group. So I kind of use the terms interchangeably. So in terms of climate change for young people, we know that young people, children and young people are the most affected in that it will affect them throughout their lifespan. The consequences of climate change and the associated consequences in terms of biodiversity loss, pollution, air pollution, water pollution, etc. All of those are going to impact them right through their lifespan. So for people who are in the middle age like myself, we're seeing those impacted, but they're not. I haven't been exposed to those particular impacts since birth, and I suppose most recent research. I'm just going to move this over here. Okay, so we know that they're most affected. It affects them across their lifespan, but also least responsible. And one of the themes that came out from a research study we did last year was that kind of intergenerational injustice that young people feel. They feel that, that older generations are the one most responsible, that made decisions around particular use of fuels, for example, and they're the people who are feeling it and experiencing it most. And so what comes with that is a lot of frustration and anger that is different than maybe people at different stages of the lifespan in terms of how they think about climate change. So they carry that burden across the lifespan. And also we know that, young people are obviously differentially impacted across geographical regions, across demographic groups. And so what we know in terms of a lot of the research is, for example, girls are more affected. People who are living in particularly vulnerable regions for extreme weather events are more affected. And then existing socioeconomic risk factors for mental illness tend to be exacerbated in particular groups. So, a child in Dublin is going to have a whole different experience of climate change than a child growing up in Madagascar, for example. They are worlds apart in terms of the resources that are available to them, but also the very direct impacts of climate change that they will have. And they're also quite different in terms of the support systems that they might have if they're displaced because of extreme weather events. So when we're talking about it, context is so important. But even within a very high resource country, like a rich country like Ireland or France, we know that some groups are more differentially affected as well. So children who are experiencing precarious housing, like we have a very significant homelessness crisis in Ireland, and children and young people who are homeless will experience the impacts of flooding, for example, in a different way. They may not have a place to a support system for it to go if they are if they're newly migrated to Ireland, then they will have, again, different experiences. So we have all of these kind of cascading effects that they impact different groups differently. And then we have, children who live on coastal regions. The fear and anxiety that they may associate with where they live will be differentially impacted, right? So it's very contextually dependent. So if we're looking at like education for well-being, our climate change education needs to be broadly. So within Ireland, within our context, climate change education tends to be focused on the scientific implications of climate change, which we know are really important for young people to understand. They tend to be integrated in geography modules, science modules, but we know that the mental health impacts and the emotional the effective responses to climate change tends to integrate across the curriculum. So what we're seeing in Ireland broadly in terms of education is a more focus on well-being within education. So we have these kind of broad curricular areas that are called well-being. So far, there hasn't been a movement towards explicitly linking that well-being to climate change, but we're hoping I'm hoping, into the future that we will consider more the impact of climate change not just as a scientific domain within the education space, but within the space of how it impacts our well-being, our individual well-being, our relational well-being with other people, and then broader planetary well-being. But I think that's a particular shift that we probably need to see more of. We have only this year, we have a new subject at our more senior level of post-primary of secondary education, that is climate action and sustainability, which is a really positive move for us. But we'd like to see it more integrated and not just within those science or geography modules, but also within other modules. We have a social, personal and health education module, and it gets a curriculum area in primary and post-primary. So we would like to see climate change education being integrated there, because we know climate change education is associated with a lot of difficult knowledge. You know, the difficult knowledge in terms of the frustration and the anger that young people can experience, the grief that's associated with it, but also the idea that, you know, that some regions are more responsible for it. So how do we teach children about climate change, the causes and the consequences of climate change, in a way that kind of minds their well-being by also acknowledging the implications of it? And that's kind of a tension in terms of how do we teach difficult knowledge. And, you know, there is quite a bit of research, I suppose, in terms of how we teach difficult knowledge in global citizenship education generally. And I think we could probably apply that more specifically to climate change in terms of dealing with difficult emotions, and how teachers plan to do that, and how they themselves as, you know, professionals consider the climate crisis, and then consider the emotional implications of that. So I just really wanted to kind of acknowledge that kind of role of well-being in our curriculum.
Can I just ask a maybe not quick, but a question about that? Because what we teach and what we do research on also depends on education politics. Of course, at the moment, we have a lot of discussions about what should we teach about climate change. In France, we have a very big focus, not so much on well-being. It's been talked about in the past few years, but at the moment, it's mostly about social and emotional learning. And within social and emotional learning, the choice is mostly on emotion regulation, on the capacity to collaborate, to work with others, not as much as I would like things like develop critical thinking and creativity. And it can't be just by accident. I think it's a real choice that is being decided on a political level. And we as researchers, we can be critical, we can think about it, but how much latitude do you have to introduce these changes? It's no coincidence at the moment that there is no real link between education for well-being or social and emotional learning and climate change, because they are seen as two different things. And in a way, climate change education aims also not only at informing students, but at giving them the tools that they need, because they will be in charge within a few years. And whereas well-being aims at making them, maybe it's a bit crude to put it that way, but education aims at teaching students to become, as we say, responsible citizen. And at the moment, we live in a capitalist environment. And so the goal of education is to make the students suitable to the current system. And that's why I think there's so much focus on emotion regulation, to make them individually responsible for their own emotions, even in a difficult context. They're also trained, or we're trying to educate them to be able to collaborate and to find new solutions, to think out of the box. So I'm a bit long, but I'm trying to put two different questions into this link between well-being and education to climate change. And my real question was, what is the latitude we have as educators or researchers when we have also educational politics, which are maybe not completely innocent?
Yeah, I mean, all of those debates are similar ones that we're having in Ireland, in terms of the different actors that are influencing education policy. We've very recently had a shift in terms of our primary curriculum that moved a little bit away from social and emotional learning to well-being more broadly. One of the criticisms that I would have of that is it doesn't define well-being. So it's about how teachers themselves interpret it. And I think it's intentionally that they don't have one particular kind of discipline that's deciding for them. But equally, it means that teachers themselves are interpreting what well-being is, and it's also associated with physical well-being. So there's a lot of, I suppose there's a lot of room for interpretation. We also have had at the same time education for sustainable development should be implemented across our teacher education programs, which is a positive move. But again, it often depends on who's the teacher and then who's a teacher educator. So if you have teacher educators who are particularly interested in this, you might have, we have a specialism for our primary education students, so they can choose to do it. But that's only 30 out of 430 students who will choose to do that. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer is other than to keep writing, trying to impact policy, trying to get a seat at the table in terms of, because everyone, I think, not everyone has good intentions, but a lot of people have good intentions in terms of education and they want their particular area. So it's really about fighting for more space for it. But it's so true. It's like the political elements of it means that it impedes the kind of political elements that you can bring into the classroom, because teachers don't feel confident, they don't feel comfortable in addressing particular issues in the classroom. There's a huge fear around parents, how they interpret it, what they want taught. We just had some colleagues of ours just had a report launched yesterday around teachers' well-being and how it's impacted by parent partnerships. Like all of the things that are happening in a wider political context are happening within the microcosms of classrooms as well. I do think it's a lot about the individuals within institutions, writing and trying to get that space at the table and talking about these particular issues. But you need collaborations and you need people to kind of support you in terms of doing that.
Yeah.
And the research is saying that it's young people are very, the emotions that they associate with climate change, their socio-political emotions, they're very much aware of the capitalist consumerist society and how that's driving climate change. So there's that frustration then with very traditional systems, and education is quite a traditional system. It's very hard to shift in terms of that.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I have an answer, Pascal, but I empathise with very similar kind of debates that we're having here. And I suppose in terms of, moving on to climate change and mental health, we know that, again, like I said, children and young people are exposed throughout their lifespan, and even from conception onwards, so even prenatally, before a child is born, they're exposed to pollution risks that are associated with risk for mental illnesses later in life. So that risk is from conception onwards. For psychopathology, children and young people particularly at risk because of their developing brain, because of their existing vulnerability to disease. They're still growing. Their physiology isn't yet developed. So for example, airborne viruses, they're more susceptible to it, and then the associated mental health impacts that might be associated with things like, for example, asthma, and those type of things. And also, we know that children and young people have limited agency and autonomy. So they have limited capacity to adapt to threats. They're very much relying on the adults or the systems within their context to be able to mitigate the impacts or adapt to the impacts of climate change. And so that then increases their risk more so than we would see in adult populations. And the impact in terms of pre-existing vulnerability. So we know there are very significant socioeconomic inequalities in mental health generally. And so the impact of climate change exacerbates those. Again, because we know demographic and geographical regions are impacted differentially. The resources are accessed differentially. So if you have somebody from a high resource family in a rich country and they're experiencing climate anxiety, they would typically have a pathway in which they can get mental health supports. Other countries or other families or contexts may not have that same access to supports. So it exacerbates what might already be vulnerabilities to mental health impacts. And then it intensifies it. So things that climate change will bring through extreme weather events, for example, like heat waves, those mental health impacts will increase. So if somebody already at risk, the experience of a heat wave, the experience of migration because of flooding, for example, the food insecurity that will come as associated with that will intensify those. And again, we can see across countries that would be quite differently experienced. So in terms of those impacts, they can be immediate. So we see the impact in terms of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, those very significant psychopathological impacts. And then associated with it, and often with extreme weather events, are behavioural and social and emotional difficulties that children and young people will experience as a consequence of often maybe leaving their home, their material goods being impacted, disruptions to school, disruptions to social networks, all of that. And then the indirect impacts. So we know for children and young people, who experience risk, there are particular resilience factors that kind of mitigate against the risks generally. And close relationships to family, good community supports, they're all really important resilience factors for children who are already experiencing risk towards mental health difficulties. And so often with an extreme weather event or an impact of climate change, there is a disruption to those. We might have a child migrating away from the immediate family, or migrating away from the extended family or the community supports that are there. If we think about children in refugee camps who are migrating because of the impact of climate change and conflict in their area, or the impact of climate change in terms of access to food and food security, they're put in a particular situation that we know leads to increased risk because they're away from sometimes they're displaced away from family, but even if they have immediate family with them, they're displaced, they're moving away from schools, community groups that are often kind of a protective structure around children. We know children don't exist in isolation. We have all of these systems that protect children. So when the migration or the family stress or the displacement disrupts all of those very supportive systems around a child and a family. And then we know it can have the psychological impacts in terms of the poor physical health that will go with climate change. So if we look at something like asthma, we see increased rates of it and the associated with stress, anxiety of children and young people who are experiencing those type of physical health impacts. And then broadly, and probably, particularly for resource-rich countries, is the existential threat that the ecological crisis brings to children and young people, and also the vicarious experience of extreme weather events. So even young people who aren't experiencing it themselves, seeing other children and young people or people in general being impacted by extreme weather events. We know as humans we're empathic beings, so that vicarious experience can have a significant impact as well. And we do want that empathy, but also a support for that empathy in terms of risks. So I'll just talk about climate anxiety. We might take a break then to have a chat about some of this kind of pre-existing or the existing research. But one of the kind of more prevalent or more commonly discussed mental health impact for children and young people is climate anxiety, or what some people would call eco-distress, eco-paralysis, eco-anxiety, solastalgia, that kind of anxiety and grief that comes with the disruption or the destruction of our natural environment. And within this context, we kind of differentiate between mental illness and mental health. So if we're looking at something like the WHO kind of perspectives on it, we know that some people will have what we would clinically be diagnosed with a mental health, with a mental illness. So things like anxiety disorder, depressive disorder. So there are actual disorders that are clinically diagnosed. And then on the other side of that would be, increased anxiety, but wouldn't necessarily meet a criteria. So looking at things like mental health, we'll be looking at ways we can support people to feel well, not just to alleviate the mental illness, but to feel well, that kind of idea of well-being rather than psychopathology. So we're kind of looking at it in terms of the continuum. And so climate anxiety kind of fits within that. We know some people will meet a particular criteria, but often with much of this research is for people who wouldn't meet a clinical criteria for anxiety, but they have a lot of these anxious thoughts, that climate concern and worry that go with it. Often it's not differentiated, and there's a huge variability in terms of how researchers define climate anxiety or eco-anxiety, or the terms that they use. Some researchers will talk about it in terms of that kind of biomedical mental health or mental illness kind of perspective. So looking at things like obsessive thinking, depressive disorders, and the possibility of increasing mental illness. Others will talk about it in terms of concern for the environment, worry, and some talk about it as being motivational, and some, motivational to action, that we can do something when we're concerned. The difficulty is within that context is that lack of differentiation. We do want people to be concerned about climate change, to do something about it, but we don't want them to be, or we don't want ourselves or anyone to be as concerned that it's a mental illness. So like, where do we draw the line there? And often, like I said, in the research, it's not very well defined. People use quite different definitions of that. So some papers will specifically talk about symptoms of anxiety, like panic attacks, insomnia, that would be used for clinical diagnosis. And others would talk about concern, but often when we're talking about climate change attitudes, we would talk about concern and worry as something that we want people to be concerned and worried about. So maybe this might be a good point to really see any discussion points or questions.
Yeah, do you have any comments or questions, either online or in the room? Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I would like
You have to speak very loud because maybe I can tell me.
So you talked about ecology as perceived by group age. So I would like to understand more, how do you define adolescent, for example, as a group age? Because I think you
talked about it before. Before you arrived, I think.
Okay.
Yeah,
because I heard that you said both biological and social definition of it. So, and how is it specific? How ecological is specifically impact? How a generation is specifically impacted by the ecological change, and why is it important to study it on a group age? Yeah.
So I suppose in terms of adolescence, we kind of talked about that we're using that WHO definition from 10 to 14 as adolescence. But we kind of use the term adolescence and young people interchangeably, because we know that some young people prefer not to be referred to as adolescents, some people do. And that particular definition is drawn on kind of brain development, so that physiological, biological development, and that we see that, but also we know in terms of the kind of period where people are still in education before larger kind of adult moratoriums around marriage and stuff are being put off for later, the idea of emerging adulthood, emerging from 18 onwards. So that's kind of the definition that we're using for adolescence. And sorry, what was the second question there?
I think my question is more like, how is this group of age adolescents have a common experience of climate changing? Because I think this is the concept of studying a generation. It's saying that this group of persons have a common experience, and we are looking at what is it. So it could be eco-distress, eco-paralysis, etc. So how is it specific in a generation? Because I think there are a lot of different group of people of social situation in a generation. So what is specific when you study a generation?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So basically, there's very little comparative to older or not adult populations. There's less research on adolescence and young adulthood. So we're looking at that because there's less of it, but that's not to say that they're all in the same group. So we know that different groups will experience it differently, and all those contexts will influence on it. But even say, for example, the research I'm doing in Ireland, we know that there are groups. So I'll present in a study now, and there are kind of 3 clusters of groups in terms of how they understand climate change. Some are more concerned, some are less concerned. As a large demographic group, young people tend to be more concerned about climate change than older people, and that's fairly consistently found across large studies. That young people tend to be more concerned. We know from that research in terms of, or we know from that lifespan exposure that they're going to be disproportionately impacted. And then one of the studies that I'll present now is that young people are quite angry at that intergenerational kind of impact of climate change on their lives, and the causes of it being, they're less proportionately responsible for the crisis. Yeah. But your point in terms they're not all the same group, yeah, it's very much so. But I mean, that's the nature of research. And it kind of comes down to research methodologies as well. What I'm going to present to you is mainly qualitative. So it's a small group of young people. They're obviously quite different in terms of, people in general have different perceptions of climate change. So we can only make generalizations based on the samples that we have.
Yeah, what you just said about being angry is very important, I think, because when I saw these words, eco-distress, eco-paralysis, nostalgia, I was wondering if you also had in Ireland something that in French it's called eco-colère. Somebody suggested this word, so it's like eco-angriness. And I'm always disturbed to see the climate-related anxiety being described in the same terms as other types of anxiety, like social anxiety or things that may be related to individual experiences and that can be worked on. If you have social anxiety, you can work on it by gradually exposing yourself more and more to challenging situations. If you have, I don't know, phobia of crossing a bridge, the same, or lift elevators or whatever, you have this therapy approach that is validated and that is appropriate for this type of situation, because indeed you have a problem with elevators or bridges or whatever, and you can work on it and then get better. But with climate anxiety, it's not something that is inside of us, and we're rightly anxious. I mean, we have very good reasons to be anxious, and so it can't be treated in the same way. So, okay, you'll just do a little bit of meditation and you'll feel better. No, we won't feel better because nothing will happen in the outside world. So I think it's really important that we make a very strong differentiation between climate, whatever we call it. I don't like to call it anxiety, and other types of anxiety which are curable. I mean, I would treatable with usual tools we have in psychology.
Yeah, and associated with that is we're kind of pathologizing a very adequate, a very real, honest response to the climate crisis. It's like you're saying there's something wrong with you because you're seeing this very real crisis that we're experiencing, and that we will continue to experience. And yeah, I mean, all of those arguments I very much agree with. And so with the emotions as well, like in terms of those, they're very real emotions. They're very adequate. You know, it's a natural way to respond to it. I suppose at the same time, though, we do want young people to be able to cope with it, you know. And so one of the things that we know in terms of generally for well-being is that self-determination, the sense of control and autonomy. But we as individuals have very little of that because of those wider societal structures that are causing climate change. And you know, the frustration, if we look at the recent COP, for example, in terms of, you know, lack of movements and lack of acknowledgement of very significant industries that are causing and naming those. So it's a very natural response, you know, and that's why it's really important that we don't pathologize it, that we don't think about mental illness, which is typically something that impairs our, you know, our ability to live our lives. But this is going to impact our lives throughout our lives, you know. And you're right in terms of that individual response. We often, you know, that idea of carbon footprints as well. We think about the individual causes and then the individual response as if it's an individual's responsibility to deal with this large global crisis. Okay.
Thank you, Ashling. Any other comment or questions? Online, you can also ask questions on in the chat if it's easier. Okay, otherwise we can just go on.
Okay. I'm going to talk very quickly about just a systematic review we're doing, because one of the things we know is that extreme weather events caused by climate change lead to particular mental health impacts. So we're doing a systematic review at the moment, and a particular study in Ireland on flooding, because flooding is probably the most common extreme weather event that we would experience in Ireland. And very recently, in the last couple of days, we've had communities who are impacted by flooding. And when in terms of that review, the most common problems as a result of flooding are post-traumatic stress. So intrusive memories of the experience, like things that we would typically see in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, intrusive memories, trouble sleeping, feeling on edge. And then, so they're the most common, and then depression and anxiety that's associated with that. And the effects in terms of those experiences can last for months and even years after the water is gone. And obviously people who experience flooding themselves experience it more significantly. But also people whose lives weren't directly impacted. So again, it goes back to that kind of vicarious experience, or the empathy with others, are likely to have, so people who experience it directly have more mental health impacts, unsurprisingly. But also people whose homes weren't flooded, also whose lives were disrupted, also experience those mental health impacts. In terms of the study we're doing now, one of the key things that's kind of coming out, emerging from a data, now this is with adults, was the fact that communities feel like they're left behind, that the frustration, I mean, obviously the impact of flooding is very significant on their lives, but the frustration that systems around them aren't supporting them, you know, that governments, that they feel isolated. So even at like that point you made there, Pascal, in terms of being an individual piece, our research is indicating that even communities feel like they're left responsible for it. So they have to deal with it rather than having these broader governmental responses to it. And that then exacerbates. So we know all of these mental health impacts from extreme weather events. We know we're going to have these extreme weather events much more frequently, and we have to address those. But exacerbating it by not mitigating and adapting to it is something that can be done by particular systems, but it's not been done. So that just makes it takes, you know, that idea of the self-determination theory, it takes the autonomy and the control away from it. And so I'm going to talk then about more specifically about emotions and the feelings and the affective states that are associated with climate change and climate injustices. So for the most part, there's kind of this differentiation between positive and negative emotions. I don't necessarily think we should really use that taxonomy as a dichotomy, because we know in terms of human emotions, there's quite a lot of overlap between them. You know, negative emotions don't always bring poor well-being. You know, the idea of anger can be, you know, can be motivating for us, you know. So, but for the most part, the research tends to indicate that there is these kind of negative emotions like threat, sadness, anxiety, depression, anger, and positive emotions that often go with the engagement with climate change, or the collaboration that will come with it. So it's empathy, belonging, empowerment. And they're really just natural responses to the realization of the climate crisis that we're in, that we find ourselves in. One of the main kind of emotions that's used quite frequently that people talk about is the idea of hope. And there's large debates in terms of the literature, in terms of like the extent, you know, it should be termed realistic hope, or what is that hope that we should have, you know. And I'll talk to you about one of the findings that emerged from a qualitative study was because we specifically were asked young people, what do you think of hope? And they were like, hope, like what's the point? You know, that kind of Greta Thunberg quote, we don't need your hope, we need you to do something. Our young people were very much kind of that kind of ilk, that there was very little hope within it. But we know, like, so the idea that they're negative emotions is kind of presuming that we shouldn't feel them, but they're natural responses. And sometimes there can be important motivational processes and public processes as we react to climate change. So things like public protest emerge from senses of anger, frustration, and fear. And they're really important that we have those to show that kind of collaborative rising up as a response, because we need something to kind of counteract the, you know, the everyday life as normal capitalist fossil fuel reliance perspectives. So, you know, thinking about those emotions, not necessarily as a negative thing, you know, that we experience, but as something that can be a driver for a different way of being, and a push towards kind of more public uprising, I suppose, in terms of the climate crisis and responses. And then positive emotions have been associated with the antecedents and also the consequences of engagement and action, particularly for young people. The idea of particularly like working together on something, the positive emotions that come from that engagement can be really empowering. But what's frustrating then is the sense that goes nowhere. You know, when we see, I presume you had something similar to the Fridays for Future. Was that a couple of years ago? That has really lost its momentum here in Ireland, but maybe 4 or 5 years ago it had a lot. But that frustration that it wasn't really going anywhere. You know, we didn't see, or the young people involved in it didn't necessarily see those huge changes in terms of policy shifts, or the kind of, you know, life is normal. So we know that, like, in terms of those emotions can be important for engagement, and then engagement can help young people feel more in control, have a better sense of solidarity, and often kind of lay the groundwork, you know, in terms of, as developmental psychologists, we see how that can be like a kind of a turning points in the lifespan, can then lay the groundwork for lifetime commitments towards climate change action. It can kind of build a kind of sense of collective efficacy in terms of reducing that ecological threat, but it doesn't necessarily take it away. You know, so they're really difficult kind of ideas to grapple with. So like the idea that like collective action can lead to better senses of solidarity. And if we look at things like that Decky and Ryan theory of self-determination theory, you know, one of the key parts of that, or two of the key parts, one is relatedness and one is autonomy or control. Relatedness kind of can become associated with those collaborations and those that solidarity we get from collective action. And then the autonomy is like the extent to which they can do something, you know, that any of their actions has any kind of impact in terms of, and so that's what's one of the kind of most difficult things about climate change engagement is like that geographical distance that we often feel in terms of, it's not something that's impacting me right now. The social distance, it's not impacting me, but also that temporal distance. I mean, we're seeing the impacts of climate change even in less vulnerable countries like ourselves more frequently now. But people don't necessarily have it on their agenda, as much. We still have like pockets of politicians whose climate change is their particular agenda, rather than being on, it's not something that comes up in the doorsteps when people are canvassing, for example, in Ireland. So I'd open that again up to some questions or discussion.
Yeah. Once again, I would ask how, like, for adolescents is different to be cured by being an agent. I would say a lot of adolescents have a greater agency power than adults, depending on their social situations. So how is the adolescent situation is specific in terms of being able to act to kind of cure the anxiety?
I suppose if we're thinking about young under 18s, they can't vote. Like that's one of the greatest powers we have in terms of a democracy is voting for parties. Like under 18s can't do that. There's lots of ways that their autonomy is impeded, not being of adult age, because we know we have particular systems that protect children and young people, which is important because of their age, but sometimes they impede it. And research does tell us that if we look at, like, for example, children's rights, children's rights to protection and provision tend to be protected way above participation rights. Like we have different kind of pockets of participation of young people in political systems, but they're very much pockets. They're not spread throughout. So I think their autonomy is limited more than I mean, everyone's autonomy is limited in a certain way, but the fact that they can't engage in that political process is particularly frustrating for them.
Yeah.
But I would say that for some adolescents, for example, have the possibility to act for, I don't know, like reproduction of international like how would say that? Sorry for my English.
Yeah, no, message.
Yes.
Like some children from high social classes can act and can be represented in the like mediatic class, for example, or can meet other children from the international childhood, I would say, I don't know, adolescents. For example, les reproductions de l'ONU, je sais pas comment on appelle ça. Like those kind of things exist, but in another way, if you are an adult from a poor social class, you really have no way to express, and you are you could be way more exposed to climate change than if you are a children. So how I'm not sure I really understand how, like, the adolescent or the childhood group shows something specific. Like, for example, you said like 100 studies were made about social climate change on children. But like in those studies, do you have like a knowledge of what social class those children belongs, and is there like psychological differences in like the reception of the climate crisis? It's a lot of
no, so your point in terms of people being differentially affected is definitely true. Not all children have the same control, and so that is a disproportionate effect in terms of those socioeconomic risks and the geographic risks that we talked about already. So that's broadly, we know that's the case. So I very much agree with what you're saying there, that young people will be differentially impacted. Some of them will have a higher social capital, cultural capital. they'll have better schools for engaging. Like all of those things will play a role in it. But as a broad group, they also can be seen as a group that has less voice in the political sphere in terms of change than adults, because they cannot vote and they cannot participate in political, for the most part. They can't participate in political spheres in the same way as adults can. Like we have a child participation unit in one of our departments in Ireland, but for the most part, they're all adults who are making those decisions, you know. So we have a kind of movement towards it, but for the most part, it's adults making decisions. You know, if we look at, for example, the European Green Deal has no mention of the role of children and young people in terms of developing those. So like, we do know that they're within the group of adolescents and children that there are people will have more voice than others, but as a group they tend to have less voice. But then also within, like I agree with you, in the adult groups there will be some people who have more and a less voice because of their social capital, or whatever term you might want to use for that. Just to say that those 100 studies were studies on flooding and mental health. So that was a mixture of adults and young people. That was specifically looking at flooding and extreme and mental health.
And I think your question generally can be asked about anything and everything, because your question, if I understand correctly, is to what extent can the result be generalized, and no result can be general, especially with qualitative research, but we can't embrace everything and anything at the same time. So by definition, any research will be like putting a light on a specific space, and you can ask the question you've asked about anything. I mean, any topic, even outside human sciences. If you study one specific molecule for treatment, you can ask exactly the same question. So we know the limits of our studies, I think, and Ashling was very clear. And for instance, when you said you take adolescents from 10 to 24, of course, in this age group, half of it are people who can vote. So they, from that point of view, they may be closer to the adults, but at the same time, they're not responsible of the current situation to the same extent, not as much as older adults who have been in this world for a long time and contributed more to climate change. But again, among all these adults and older adults, not everybody has contributed to climate change. There are countries who have very, very low contribution to that. So, of course, if we try to say something quite general, we're going to have limitations. But I think we're all aware of it, and it should be taken as a kind of the premises of our reasoning. So.
But then I would ask another question, that would be, why the generation point of view? Because I totally agree with the generalization. As long as you study a social group, you have to like isolate.
Yeah, but I think Ashling has said several times that this age group is often not is often understudied and has their voice not very heard. So I don't know if you expect another answer if this is not satisfactory. So. Ashling, you were asking if we're going to have a break. Do you want to have a 5 minutes break? Yeah, welcome back.
Great. Okay. Okay, so I might start then talking about the two particular studies. These are qualitative studies. And I suppose also to the point that was made earlier, like I'm a developmental psychologist. So for the most part, I'm interested in how different stages of the lifespan interact with different kind of social issues. So other people would have very different kind of approaches to understanding in understanding this. Now, I didn't get my slideshow. Okay, that's shown again there?
Yeah, it's full screen now.
Great, perfect. Okay. So I'll talk to you about two studies, but mainly this one study, because the other one we're still preliminary, is still very preliminary. We're just analysing the data as we go through it. So this was called the CCE study. It was a piece of research that we worked on with a group of young people in Ireland that are called, it's called the Climate Ambassador Programme. It's run by a civil society group, and they have climate ambassadors from all ages that work in their communities. But we worked with the young climate ambassadors that they had in a youth advisory panel. So they kind of advised us in terms of for the most part, we were looking, the main research questions were how do young people perceive climate change and the recommendations for education. They were very, very broad. But what we found was they had very little recommendations for education because their experience of education was quite minimal in terms of climate change education. For the most part, they were talking about kind of broader socio-emotive experiences of climate change. So we had an advisory panel, and then we had a young co-researcher. So there was a young person, she was 24 at the time, who did most of the focus groups and was kind of within that kind of age group of our participants. And we did a range of focus groups and interviews in schools and colleges around Ireland. And the young people were aged 15 to 25, and we used a photo voice methodology. So there were focus groups mainly. I think there were 3 interviews altogether, but mainly focus groups. And we asked the young people to take a picture of their local environment or find a picture, an image online of what climate change represents to them. And we use this methodology. It's a methodology that's used often with kind of sensitive topics to help people discuss it in a way that maybe sometimes they don't have the language to express some of their feelings around it. And so the idea of images can help in terms of that expression, but also it can kind of facilitate us talking about different themes that are important to the participants. So rather than, we had like a topic guide, but rather than just being focused on the topic guide, we then focused on the particular images that they brought. So some young people took images of, litter in their area, or they took pictures of the coast and how that was eroding. And then some people took images from the internet. So I'll show you some of those, and we thematically analysed it. So like I said, there was very little in terms of recommendations for climate change education other than change the systems. It was very much, education is not going to be able to solve this problem. I suppose within the context of the young people, they had very, very little explicit climate change education. They would have had pockets maybe in science or geography, but some of them didn't even recollect if they had those. So it's a very particular type of approach. So most of the findings are around how they perceive it and the kind of emotive responses. So like I said, the affective and the socio-political context were the main kind of emerging themes that we found. So in terms of the young people, for the most part, a lot of the themes emerged around or centered around worry and fear, what was called the uncanny valley of climate change, the idea of like, this is happening now and we don't know, that uncertainty. And we know for human development how important certainty is for our kind of being. And so the uncertainty that goes with climate change was quite an unsettling psychological response, not knowing, but also experiencing it. So some people talked about, this is something we talked about in primary school, and now we see it really happening. And they talked about social media and how they see the real impact of climate change. Say, there was wildfires, I think, in the States, and there was flooding in Spain around the time when data was being collected. So there were very real extreme weather events that were happening globally. And they talked about experiencing the reality of climate change in their lives now, and it being less that temporal distance between it. They talked about that unsettling feeling of Irish climate and how it was different, the lack of very cold weather, increased amount of extreme weather events, storms, for example. But there was a very significant kind of fear and dread of this is actually happening, a reflection on the biodiversity loss they experience or they feel is a consequence of climate change. So they talked about, like, you look around and there's no butterflies. Where are all the butterflies was one of the key kind of was an important kind of quote that was used in one of the focus groups, and the discussion tend to center around that. And for participants, it was like an embodied response. It wasn't something that so some of the focus groups, for example, we ask, do you think about climate change much? And they would say no. But then when they started to discuss, you know that they have this kind of embodied feeling of climate change, that dread, that goes with it. So as the discussion emerged, you got this sense of their fear and their worry around it. And so an embodied response was, one of the quotes was, and then and now and again, I'll just kind of step outside and it's very warm and I have this little pit in my stomach reminder, oh yeah, that's happening and that's going to be a problem. So it was kind of a fear and also a sense of like, what can we do about it? Another key piece was anger and frustration, very much frustrated at being not responsible for climate change as individuals, as young people, and being angry at kind of capitalism and particular ways of being. You can see, sorry, I should have discussed the images from that emerged from the worry and fear was that doomsday clock, and then this AI generated image after Hurricane Milton, that somebody had said sponsored by Exxon, that frustration towards fossil fuel industries in terms of their role in climate change, but their lack of taking responsibility or any kind of response to it. And then there was like the idea of capitalistic greed, and also they identified specific individuals who were extremely wealthy, extremely powerful, and their frustration that no matter what they do, like they talked about recycling or using bamboo straws or whatever they might do, that it's so frustrating that nothing that I do will be comparative to the impact that very wealthy people or very wealthy industries have on the climate. They talked about kind of people within their own lives, so like proximal reference, so like their friends not being caring as much as them, their family not caring as much as them, to broader kind of distal references, so like corporations, societal systems. They talked about lack of public transport in Ireland, for example, and saying, well, I'd like to be able to take active transport, but I can't because I live in the country and, that there's no public transport infrastructure. So while I'd like to make decisions, I can't. They talked about lack of vegetarian options in their school canteens, all things that impeded them in terms of taking climate action that as adults we're probably better able to do. We would choose vegetarian restaurants, for example. If we and everyone is limited in terms of their travel choices, I guess, in terms of where they live, but young people felt it more so. And there was a sense of kind of a blame game. So we did, and there was quite a difference. And this is kind of goes back to the disproportionately affected and disproportionate response, because some of the studies we did in urban areas were quite different to the focus groups we did in rural areas. So we did a couple of focus groups in rural areas which had a high farming background, so children coming from farming families. And there was a real anger there in terms of their family livelihood being blamed for climate change. And they talked about how their family livelihood is impacted by climate change, so cows not being able to brought out to pasture because of the wet weather. But then all the discourse was blaming the agricultural sector or the farming sector for climate change. So as young people, they really felt that blame on them and their parents for the occupations that they have, but also that kind of sense of like the connection that the farmers have to nature and their role as kind of keepers of the land as well. They thought that was disregarded because they were blamed for all of the I suppose Ireland's kind of carbon outputs. And then, like I mentioned a few times, is that intergenerational anger. So there was like blames on individuals, very rich individuals, blames on sectors, or a sense of frustration that sectors were being blamed for it. And also the sense of that intergenerational anger. Like, I've grown up in the context of the climate crisis. I have not made decisions around fossil fuels, for example, or types of transport or what's available to me. And they kind of talked about like, do older people not care? And like I said, in the quantitative large scale studies, it does come out that young people care more, they're more worried, they're more concerned. And young people themselves felt that. They were like, well, I see people don't care as much, or they just become habituated to the problem. And their frustration in terms of their lack of agency and control. So they felt like no matter what I do, it's not going to have an impact. I can't make the choices that some people can make in terms of more pro-environmental behavior. And then linked with that was a sense of powerlessness and helplessness, the frustration of the lack of systemic responses to climate change, the frustration of like not seeing any changes, things becoming worse. And there was one of the themes that emerged was that kind of differences between a global and a local level. For the most part, what they talked about were small changes they do in their lives. So like, rewearing clothes, using wearing secondhand clothes, that emerged a lot for the young people. But then the frustration that at a global level, fast fashion is growing so proliferating so quickly. So there was a quote there: no matter how many bamboo forks and knives I use, no matter if I shut off my electricity or take 5-minute showers, what's going to happen there? It's not like it's going to make a change when someone's going on their 5th private jet trip to Santorini. And there were particular kind of celebrities who were named as being blamed for some of that. And then there was the real sadness and empathy that went with a lot of it was around the biodiversity loss, the extent to which, so that some of the images that were brought in were local biodiversity impacts of climate change or pollution. So there were images of birds, and there was discussion about the lack of birdsong that, and around that time there was a large kind of a study done in Ireland on the impact of climate change on birdsong and how there's a significant reduction in birdsong because of climate change. So there was a discussion around that, and just their exposure to the same level of the richness of fauna and nature is limited because of climate change. But also the images that they brought in were kind of, the typical image of the polar bear in the ice cap. That was brought into a couple of them. And it was the empathy for less about humans in other areas of the world, but about animals that are affected in other areas of the world. But some empathy for victims of large-scale events. And again, they talked about social media as being a role in terms of agency, that they felt like I'm better able to see what's happening because people that I wouldn't have met in real life that I know are being impacted by these extreme weather events. So it's kind of been a conduit towards that empathy. And I think that's kind of important because you're probably having the same debates around social media bans and stuff for young people in France as we're having here and in Australia. But within this, they talked about and again, these were adults, but they talked about social media as being a role in terms of solidarity and feeling empathy towards other people. And so, like I said, we asked specifically about hope. Do you have hope? To what extent does hope help you in terms of your motive, effective responses? And it didn't really emerge. Definitely didn't emerge organically. And when we explicitly asked about it, they kind of said, we can't be blindly optimistic. This is a very significant crisis that we're experiencing. Hope is not going to get us anywhere. And they mainly talked about hopelessness. One of the main, and this is, I don't know if this would be found in your context, and I'd like to hear about it, is humor was used quite a bit. So a lot of the images they talk about, like the US president, for example, and they use examples in a very humorous, kind of dark way. The idea not all billionaires are bad. So when they got to the stage that there were quite deep embodied feelings of frustration and anger, it was often offset by humor. Like somebody within the group would make a humorous response, and it was like seen as a coping mechanism. And often that does go with like feelings of grief and loss. So people try, it's a particular coping mechanism to use humor to try and deal with it. And quite a significant amount of disconnection. I try and ignore it. There's no point in worrying myself and feeling really anxious over something that realistically I'm not going to have anything to do with. So I might stop there again and see what people's perspectives on that. Like, is it something that maybe mirrors people's experiences in terms of response to climate crisis?
I had a question. I think the methodology is very interesting to ask people to bring something that symbolizes climate change. At the same time, we always have bias in our studies, and doesn't it create a bias that will focus on negative emotion and negative aspects, because they're not going just to bring a beautiful picture of a beach somewhere in the world, because we know that all these beaches may get flooded by the water level rising. So I'm asking that also because when we conducted our research with the students, when we were discussing the topics, one of the topics they wanted to explore in the beginning was, why are some people reluctant to take actions to change their behaviors, to do something to protect the planet? And at that time, I told them, because they're real adolescents, I mean, they're like 15, 16, I told them it could be quite depressing to focus only on why people who are not doing anything don't want to do anything, because also research already brings some answers to that. And therefore, I directed them more towards some questions that I felt could be more empowering, like the question of civil disobedience. And so this idea of using, bringing a picture as a starting point for discussion, I think induce a very, maybe at least has a lot of chances to induce a very dark mood and discussion mode and emotional mode. So I don't know what you think.
Yeah, potentially it did. Now, we didn't say not, they could have brought pictures of climate protests. They could have brought pictures of more uplifting, you would find kind of more hopeful images. They didn't, and potentially it did. And I suppose in terms of bias as well, also to note, and we're finding it with our current study as well, when you go into schools, often the teachers try and pick the students who they think will give you the right answers, and so there's that kind of bias when you're recruiting through schools. So you could tell that they were kind of nearly the ambassadors for the school that were coming into the focus groups. And so some of them were talking about the actions that they do within the school and how empowering they find that. But again, I'm like, well, I think there's probably a bias in who the teachers chose to be part of the focus groups. I don't think they chose them. I mean, you've got informed consent and all of that, but I think the nature of going in recruiting through schools, and they want their school to be represented. So they're like, in one of the focus groups, the teacher sat in on the focus group and I had to ask them to leave because you could just tell the responses were just not as you would like them, not as honest or as forthright as you'd like them to be, So yeah, I think the photo voice methodology potentially does bias it, but actually did enrich it. And in some cases, like, the young people didn't know where to start. So just having the image, why did you choose this image? And it helped us get at the local and the global. So like, for the most part, the younger adolescents, so like the 15 and 16-year-olds, brought in the local images, whereas the older ones, the ones in universities and colleges brought in the kind of images from the internet, the sponsored by Exxon type of it.
Yeah, that's an amazing one, yeah.
So really our conclusions and recommendations from that was really the importance of that socio-political education responses that you mentioned at the beginning, Pascal, in terms of how do we do it at kind of formal and informal. So because we worked with the climate ambassadors as part of that program, that's a kind of informal education piece that they do. So although we might be frustrated with the formal, and we do want the formal to be, to take that particular perspectives around socio-political responses, you know, the way that you can have action as well is through informal education and partnering with different groups that do it, because we still have some level of independent groups providing this education outside of schools. And then really, given that for the most part, most of the responses were this affective emotional response, the importance of affect-driven climate change education is really important. And like I said at the beginning, most of our education tends to be scientifically based, and our teachers don't necessarily feel as comfortable with the affect side of things, you know. And I'm sure you're similar in that there's increasing mental health problems generally in adolescence. So we have higher rates of anxiety than previous. I mean, there's many reasons, maybe it's measurement reasons, and within our secondary school population. So the education system is grappling to deal with that, and then also bringing in these difficult knowledge things to discuss. It's difficult for teachers. I know for people who are doing work with teachers, they say, you know, it's when you open up that box in terms of those emotional responses, how do you manage that then, you know, within the classroom? And key within this is that intersectoral response, you know, in terms of that, like I do some work with our Department of Climate in Ireland, but very infrequently do they mention education. Whereas, because I'm in faculty of education, I feel like education is such a key way to address some of these issues. But there is that kind of lack of intersectoral kind of responses between our mental health responses, our educational responses, and our broadly climate adaptation and mitigation responses. And then we found that the youth involvement was a really good way of doing it. If I had done this study with just colleagues, I wouldn't have found the same results as having that youth group and having the co-researcher there. One of the focus groups I facilitated myself, and I could tell that the responses were very different to the ones that the younger researcher elicited from them, because she was more at that stage of life, very interested in climate change. So she facilitated the focus groups in a very different way than I would do.
Can you remind us the age of the students? I mean,
they were 15 to 24. For the most part, they were 15 to 80. Yeah. Most of them were in schools.
Okay.
I think there was probably, I can't remember exactly, but I think maybe 7 or 8 were in the older age group, but most of them were when we went into schools, yeah.
How many people were there in each group?
It depended. So we did it, I think it was 3 interviews, and then it depended. Some of them only had like 3 or 4, and then others, I can't remember exactly, but others might have had 7 or 8.
Yeah, because it can be difficult to speak when you're in a big group with 7, 8 people, depending on how easy it is for you to speak in public. Or
yeah, and some of them were groups of people who knew each other, you know, so we were looking for participants. They said, oh, I'll get a few of my friends to go in, and so it was a different nature of the dynamic than others. But just in terms of recruiting for focus groups, it was so challenging to get focus groups. Yeah, just to get people who were available and then say, can you come at this time, and the other people aren't available at this time. It was way easier to recruit. That's why we had the 3 or 4 interviews at the end, because it was just not possible to schedule it. And that's just a practical kind of element of it.
Yeah, you could not go to the schools themselves to organize the focus group, could you?
No, I did. In some schools we did, but then some we just recruited outside. Schools are very reluctant as well. You know, there's so many requests for research. They get so many requests that they only do. So it was only schools where I knew a teacher, or there was some kind of connection so in the schools it was fine, but doing any focus groups outside of schools or in colleges was the more challenging bit, to get groups of people together and to bring them. We were doing them all in person because of that photo voice. We weren't able to do any Zoom. It just wouldn't have elicited the same kind of responses, you know.
No, it does get more and more difficult, not only with focus groups, but also when we do surveys, for instance, to get answers, because people just keep on seeing all these say solicitation in English? I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
they're asked to participate in various surveys on everything and anything. And so you get tired of it, and people say, oh, it won't take more than 10 minutes. And in the end, it's never true. So
Exactly. Yeah, it's very difficult. And we're recruiting now for the next study I'll talk about, but what we're trying to do there is kind of give something back. So we go into the schools and do workshops, or we offer placements in the college for the young people who take part, or if we're trying to get like a key person, like a student in each school, and then they can come and do a placement with us. And they're typically young people who are really interested in climate change, you know.
very nice.
But it is very, very difficult. And another piece of research we did, and this was mainly with adults, we did a systematic review of climate change attitudes. And so that was across the line. So we were looking at children, young people, adults, but most of the research on climate change attitudes are with adults. Very, very little with children, and very, very little in terms of longitudinally how they might change across the different age groups. But climate change attitudes are really important because we know that climate change is unequivocally driven by humans. So it's really critical that we kind of understand those internal processes in terms of how we think about climate change. It's important for support for policy, so we know more positive attitudes. And it's really strange to talk about positive attitudes towards climate change because we don't want to have positive attitudes, but a positive attitude towards engagement or mitigation, or the need for policies, are key for adopting climate change policies. And we know that there's quite a considerable gap. So even when people are motivated towards climate change, concerned about it, think we should do something about it, there's still that gap between that attitude and behavior. So when we're looking at climate change attitudes, kind of maybe 10, 15 years ago, more people looked at belief, whether we believe in climate change or not. For the most part, most people do. Well, in European studies, there's a significant high level of belief, although that is vulnerable to erosion again in terms of greater, particular actors who are spreading mis and disinformation around climate change. But when we're looking at attitudes, we're looking at not necessarily denial, but more skepticism. Oh, so maybe climate change is happening, but it's not as big a problem as other people are saying, or it's not wholly caused by humans. There's some natural variability. Those type of more skeptical responses, rather than saying climate change is outright not happening. And so like the attributions of the causes of climate change and the skepticism about the impacts that it will have on it. In terms, we reviewed, I can't remember the exact, I think it was about 700 studies in the end, through a systematic review of European samples of climate change. So we have high levels of belief, but still there's large minorities who don't understand the human causes of climate change. And there's quite a significant kind of gap in terms of climate literacy. So although people believe in it, climate literacy was poor. We have this large study in Ireland called Climate Change in the Irish Mind. I don't know if I know there's climate change in the Australian mind, climate change in the American minds. There might be something similar in France, but
Not
in
that I
that study,
know.
pardon?
Not that I know of. I don't.
Okay. It's run by our Environmental Protection Agency. It's a governmental piece, and it's influenced. So it's run by the government, and it's taken the. So I just actually have to run for 1 second, Pascal. I'm really sorry.
Sorry?
I just need to run for 1 second.
Yeah, sure. Don't worry, we're still here.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the kind of biases in terms of understanding of climate literacy. So that's typically measured by the extent to which people understand the small, medium, and large impacts of the carbon emissions for different types of behaviors, um, or understanding of what causes the greenhouse effect. So those more scientific type of variables. There's kind of a concern about not great levels of climate literacy. But across a load of studies and samples, younger people tend to be less skeptical. Women tend to be more concerned. There's kind of what people talk about white male conservative effect, so conservatives tend to be provide less support for policy. Women tend to provide more support for policy, and then white males tend to have a greater likelihood of skepticism, or less likely to accept policy. Generally, left-leaning individuals tend to attribute climate change to human causes more so than right-leaning individuals. So we see the kind of, in terms of political orientations, that differentiation. That's much more strongly found in the US, in US samples and in European samples. That kind of polarization in terms of climate change beliefs, climate change skepticism, and acceptance of climate change policies. While we do see that kind of political orientation effect, it's not as strong in Europe. And in Europe, there's kind of a more kind of broader sociocultural impacts in terms of climate change engagement. So things around populism and anti-elitism, there seems to be an increased level of climate skepticism or acceptance of particular policies within the European context. And so that's got a significant impact in terms of how we communicate about climate change. So using experts may not be as appropriate for some groups than others. Maybe using more community members to try and communicate around climate policies might be more appropriate for some groups that have a particular kind of anti-elitism kind of perspective. And one of the kind of concerning findings in some of the studies was the idea of as we see increased intolerance that we would want to see generally anyways towards particular groups, so immigrants, LGBT groups, that intolerance, or what we call social dominance orientation, that view of some groups being better than other groups, we also see increases of climate change skepticism. So with increased kind of disinformation and misinformation, that at the same time that we're seeing these negative attitudes towards groups of people and prejudicial attitudes, racial attitudes, every increase of that also increases skepticism. So there's a kind of suggestion that there's particular negative actors who are trying to increase particular perspectives on society. And as part of that climate change skepticism is associated with that. But in the review, we did very little research in terms of young people's attitudes. So we know for the most part, young people tend to be more concerned. But beyond that, there's not a huge amount of research on it. So it's hard for us to tell, the comments about, the different groups. We know very little about it. And so young people might have different kind of trajectories when it comes to their worry about climate change. So overall, as a large group, they tend to be more concerned. They tend to feel more strongly and engage in more climate change behavior. But that's a group, and they're probably the group that take part in our studies, who are engaged with it. They have critical thinking analysis in terms of the information that they encounter in terms of climate change. They engage in the political marches, make lifestyle choices. So that's a group that have that higher level of concern. But we know less about the other groups of about young people. So we are doing a study now, and I've put the site up here. Now it's in Ireland, so it's very much focused on Irish young people, but it's a longitudinal study where we're trying to track through attitudes, behaviors, emotion, well-being, anxiety type of indicators from the age of 12 through adolescence. So we're hoping that more information will come from that, but I'll just finish off on this study that we're doing as part of it. And this was another qualitative study. So we're doing a larger quantitative study, but we won't have findings from that for a few years. But this was a smaller qualitative study with 15 to 18-year-olds with structured interviews. And where we did kind of a social identity map. So we asked them, are there particular turning points in your life when you start to think about climate change? We asked them to do a life drawing of their understanding of the environment, and then the people in their lives generally, and how they relate to climate change, you know. So if they drew teachers, we were looking at that. If they drew peers or friends or family, how they drew that, and did a reflexive thematic analysis. So this is very much preliminary findings. We haven't finished it. But again, we're working with a youth participative methodology. So we have a larger youth advisory group for this, and it's they go from age 12 up to 18. And then we've 2 co-researchers who are working on it as well, and they are third level students. And what we found so far are the kind of 3 developmental patterns in terms of how about attitudes and emotions. So they talked about kind of maturing emotional responses as they get older, you know. So they talked about when they were younger, less mature kind of feeling. So early feelings of uncertainty tended to shift to more concrete emotions, more sustained worry, sadness about environmental loss, and anger at the injustices. So as their knowledge increased, their kind of anger at the injustices associated with climate change tended to increase. They also showed the kind of developmental changes in how they coped with the emotions. So initially there was a lot of, they talked themselves about them avoiding or downplaying the issue, but with time they engage in more intentional strategies around discussing the concerns with peers, seeking out information, and engaging in small actions that they felt they had autonomy and control over. And then finally, kind of the role of the relational and cultural context in terms of shaping their emotional development and coping. So they talked about online communities, teachers, and families in helping them interpret the feelings that they were feeling in terms of climate change, the moral positions, and resulting young people in terms of thinking about climate change as an equity and social justice issue. So they, in some way, they needed those wider contexts of families, schools, online communities to help them process the emotions that they were thinking about, and to think about those broader issues around climate injustice and the climate justice as a broader context rather than climate change specifically.
And about that, I'm echoing Corentin's question. You, in this case, you gave some different elements from studies on adults and studies on adolescents, and you didn't talk about politics about adolescents. Is it because it didn't arise, or because adolescents could be less politically aware? And also you didn't mention anything about racism or fear of or at least hostility against minorities, because it's a question we had in the study we conducted with our students, and we thought we couldn't ask directly the people where they place themselves politically on which side, because anyway, people may not be completely honest in their answers, and there's like social desirability in a way. But they found some studies that show that there is maybe a link between the feeling about social justice and political views. So that's why we introduced a questionnaire about social justice. And interestingly, in what you just mentioned about adolescents, this question of social justice being very connected with environmental questions arose also. So do you have any ideas why, in this case, do we have real differences between adults and adolescents, or is it a bias caused by the methodology?
Yeah, in the qualitative study we didn't, but in our in our longitudinal, the quantitative, we do have a measure of climate justice beliefs. And we do have like just that dichotomy of where do you place yourself on the political spectrum of left to right, you know, they just move a cursor. Why did we not look at more broadly social justice issues? I guess we could have. It just wasn't part of our research question. It didn't emerge, but also to say within that, like the bias of the schools was very particular there, you know, so they were unlikely to be young people who were impacted by the anti-migrant racism that happens within society. They're probably aware of it, but they're not targets of it. And so that's a really significant kind of limitation. So we're hoping for the longitudinal study that we'll have larger sample, and we're particularly targeting different types of schools and, you know, informal and, you know, early school leavers, all of those things that we don't necessarily get with the qualitative.
Yeah.
But I think that the idea that like those social justice, how they play a role, we're seeing emerging from the qualitative data, that awareness of it. But I think it's really important that we do start to teach it as all of these interconnected issues, rather than, you know, something that's, you know, anti-racist education in one place and climate change in another place, you know.
That's very true. And about the other study, the previous one, types of emotions that emerge, do you think they're specific to this age group?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. But like, there's enough studies of adults that can look at it. But I don't think so. I mean, that frustration of the individual and how much we can do is probably felt across the lifespan. And we know then again, older people have again, you know, different kind of societal impacts in terms of what they can do. In terms of, you know, in Ireland, for example, we have a huge kind of push towards retrofitting houses and insulation and stuff like that in older houses. But older people struggle more with the kind of administration that would go with applying for grants. So there are definitely demographic groups that are kind of left behind in terms of the policy and very much feeling it. I don't think young adolescents are the only group feeling that frustration.
Exactly. But maybe the generational, I don't know how you say that in English, anger that you feel that some rich people and older people who could do more don't do it. I think this might be specific to this group. I don't know.
Yeah. I would love to do it. I think older people have a lot to offer in terms of climate change education, because often older people will have thought about their lives in terms of weather and climate, and they remember, like, you know, the great storm of 1982, that type of thing. And so, and also the biodiversity loss, they have greater memories of it. So I think, you know, we could use intergeneral justice to kind of maybe as a role within education. I'd love to see more of that kind of perspectives.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Jean, you had a question. Thank you very much for sending a link, by the way.
Yes. Thank you very much for your presentation. I had a question about your methodology, but you might have said it already. Sorry if I missed the point. But I was curious, what questions precisely did you ask using the photo voice methodology? And how did you choose these questions?
I don't know the exact questions now, but I could probably send them to Pascal afterwards, our topic guide. So they were broadly, do you think about climate change? What do you think about when you think about climate change? How do you think it impacts? So they were very broad questions, and they were a topic guide. So it was semi-structured. Often we didn't necessarily follow it. So some of the focus groups, it depends on the dynamic of the focus group. But I can send it to Pascal, that topic guide. And then they were determined by I kind of set them out and then sent them to the youth advisory group, and they kind of modified it. So together we kind of tailored it to what we thought would be most meaningful within that group.
Okay. Thank you. And again, sorry if I missed this, but is there a publication where you talk about this research?
No, it's under review at the moment. So once it gets past the review stage, I'll send it on. The systematic review, I do have a publication to that, and that's in Glow. I can send that to Pascal, but that's broadly in terms of attitudes. But the young people's perspective, one of them is under review, and the other one is just preliminary analysis at this stage. So we won't get it submitted till next year, I'd say.
Thank you very much, Corentin.
Yes. You talked about an affect-driven climate change education. So I was wondering if you have any idea of what would it be or what it would look like?
I suppose it would depend on the age group. So it needs to be developmentally specific. But I think what we talked about at the beginning, or your comments, Pascal, about that kind of social and emotional, that it shouldn't be about just regulating emotions. It should be the difficult knowledge. So is it Britzman has this research on difficult knowledge broadly when we're talking about, say, for example, anti-racism education. How do we teach about it, particularly to white children who might be, whose histories are implicated in racism? How do we teach those things in a way that we can be critically engaged with social justice issues without kind of shutting down people? So how do we teach that difficult knowledge? So in the same way, I think the same kind of approaches could be used for affect-driven, to acknowledge the emotions, but to look at the kind of underlying causes and that kind of solidarity of, the importance of solidarity in terms of that. But that will take a lot in terms of teacher preparation. How do we teach teachers to do it? Like my previous research context was on relationships and sexuality education and the difficulties that teachers have in terms of teaching these particular topics. And I think climate change kind of falls within that. But if we were to do it, it would be kind of developmentally appropriate and determined by the context, So if we have, if schools are in areas that are more prone to extreme weather events or disadvantaged neighborhoods, then they should have a particular approach to it. So it's really contextually determined.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question online or? Yeah, sure.
Just a question. My question is a very general question, but I think that as climate change becomes more serious, it seems like social division becomes also more so deep between who don't dream, who act for the climate change, and those who don't act for climate change, don't believe the climate change. So in Japan, also the United States, also a lot of people who don't act also for the climate change. So my question is the capacity of solidarity, the communicate with people, it's very important skill for the climate change, of course, but also we don't have much skill to communicate with who have completely opposite opinion, skills to communicate with people who completely opposite. This kind of skill is for me, it's very important to for the more people know the climate change and a lot of people engage this problem. So is there the category of emotion, eco-emotion, this kind of skill, to communicate with people who don't act, who deny maybe the climate change like that. So its category is really important for this separation of the people. So
You mean space for debate? Or?
debate.
Yeah, I know from the Climate Change in the Irish Mind that I mentioned, they are specifically designing kind of communication strategies that everyday people can use, citizens can use. So if you're talking to somebody who is denying climate change, how should you approach it? That kind of to try and reduce social division. I think there's definitely political actors who are intentionally trying to divide people in terms of climate change acceptance, and acceptance of policies. And with that goes all the anti-immigrant, anti-other bias, whatever the other might be. And so there's a really important part in terms of communications and climate communication, that we're doing it accurately, but we're also not making people feel like they're left behind, because there are definitely some social groups who feel like they're left behind, and you know that they don't frame things in terms of climate change. So maybe framing things in terms of health or pollution, or framing things in terms of economics, or you know, the impact in terms of, like, very recently we had you know, debates around, should we frame things in terms of the cost to Ireland if we don't implement these policies, rather than the immediate cost, you know. So it's framing, but there are definitely different demographics and different belief systems. But it's important that we communicate appropriately. So like I said, that climate change in the Irish mind, they're trying to work out ways, they've kind of differentiated between different types of groups of people in terms of their beliefs and attitudes, and then we might communicate to them differently. But in terms of your question around the feelings and emotions, eco-emotions, probably the solidarity part is really important. You know, the idea that we're all in this, we're feeling it. And we, like, a lot of the time in the focus groups, especially for the young people, they didn't know that other people were feeling it. So it started off very quiet. What do you think about climate change? Very little. And then once people started to talk about it, you could feel the embodiment of it. And also people go, well, I didn't realize you felt that same way, you know. So there was kind of an acknowledgement of it. But I don't know what you do about that division, that social division, that I think is going to be one of the significant kind of challenges to us accepting policies.
Well, at the moment, not enough, I think, but it's really something we need to think about. Well, thank you very much, Ashling. It was fascinating, and I think it's very rich to try to understand better the point of view of young people, and to do it in different ways. I really hope we keep in touch. Anyway, I'll contact you about the other project. And so next week we'll have a sociologist, his name is Kjell Noordzee from Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And so if you're interested, I put the recording of the sessions on a YouTube channel, so it's always possible to access it. Thank you so much, and hope to see you soon. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.